I would like to start somewhere completely different than what we thought about. And this is, I will have to share this with you. Perfect. So I want to start in the jungle in an African country by the name of Congo. The Buti Pygmies, they live there. They're an especially peaceful people of hunters and gatherers, although they're best known for being among the shortest on our planet, in average about 137 centimeters. The Pygmies have the idea that the human self is a transparent bubble that surrounds us. So wherever we go, our bubble will follow us, and at all times we're just right in the center of the transparent bubble, and that is ourselves. Mbuti say that while the bubble is with us, we are in balance. However, it may happen that you get out of it. So suddenly, and with many consequences, you don't have your bubble. It happens, for example, when you feel excessive anger, if you move so fast that you don't notice your surroundings, or if you just use violence against other people or against yourself, or if you suffer violence or experience a tragedy, then you just leave your bubble. That is, you're not longer yourself. So the Mbuti tells us that it's frequent that the people or the person who has just left his bubble is so absorbed in what she or he feels that and what is going on there, that he does not realize that he's no longer in his self. So this is why the community is so important, because those who realize that someone has gone out of the bubble and lost their balance have a duty to notify the person. If it is just a minor issue, it's recommended that people sit down immediately and quietly in a very comfortable place to wait for the bubble to gradually catch up with them. If it's something more complicated, the community has a responsibility to see how to make the bubble return again, be it with dialogues, with a collective effort of somehow make changes and do walks in spiritual places. So it's very clear that for the Mbutis, recovering balance for a troubled person is always directly related to re-establishment of the constructive communication with the society. So for me, this conception of the bubble as an interactional self and the participation of the group or community to bring it back when it's left behind has much to do not only with understanding of justice, but also with solution focus. So to explore this quite far from the Mbuti Pygmies, or at least apparently, I would like to put a few words on the current situation of justice. So when we talk about the situation of justice, we commonly refer to the status of the justice systems. This is, of course, this is not a thorough analysis of how all the countries in the world has installed legal systems or the differences and similarities. What I find significant is that worldwide, people talk about the way of handling justice seem to be in crisis. And why do we say that? We say that because most courts are totally overwhelmed by cases. And resolution processes take years and years. There's uncountable studies show that resolutions of the justice system reflect bias of social status, race and gender and other things. So access to justice has higher and higher costs. And the execution of verdicts is impossible after many years of procedures. For persons being sentenced, in many situations, the punishment apparently only gets more profound and severe when they go back to their communities after ended sentence. And if we look towards, for example, the private sector, during the last 15 years, the private sector all over the world have turned away from the justice systems. We can see that, for an example, in the thing that among Fortune 1000 companies, for 15 years ago, there was only 1% of them that used the methods of alternative justice, while the last study from 2015 shows that now 99% of them use principally alternative justice. So in these shortcomings are even more noticeable when we turn to all the challenges that new technologies represent, artificial intelligence and highly complex developments in the future. And if some of you wonder what is this that we are looking at now, it's a 3D printed steak, just in becoming a steak. We can also find similar experience with the shortcomings when it comes to social conflicts. And all this marking the last 10, 15 years, including the conflicts on gender, race, migrants, even in those cases when it's possible to prove correctly, develop justice procedures, it is clear that there's just something that does not seem right. It's interesting because questionnaires all over the world show falling trust in the justice systems and also a rapid growing dissatisfaction. What is more important, though, is that the majority of people who have won legal cases do not feel either that they have actually achieved justice. Isn't that interesting? So they argue that even though they have confirmed, they're being confirmed that they are right, their conflict, their anger, the traumas have not been solved. So it could look like people relate justice with some kind of experience of restoration and not the idea of just being right or having the responsible judged or punished. It also seemed that the conventional legal systems or public mechanisms are not able to create that experience. So legal initiatives, new legal initiatives and methods are starting to get integrated to make up for this. The most used methods within what is now called alternative justice, or ADR for the alternative dispute resolution, are arbitration, conciliation, mediation, as well as restorative sessions and circles. So the solution-focused approach is not mentioned among these methods, which is my best hope that in a few years this will have changed. And we will be able to meet in one of these world conferences, and we will be able to talk about what worked to be part of the methods contributing to create a different experience of justice. And I say this because the solution-focused approach has something very unique to offer. Usually I'm not very fond of simplifying and generalizing too much when we don't have time for actually describing why or what have brought me to that. However, I will just mention a very few things that could be differences between the approaches we just mentioned. And let's see. So if we can just see in the table, it could be a lot more different aspects. But when conciliation give people a vibe to solve the situation, a certain situation, they usually focus only on a case between 2 or 3 people and not the context. The mediation facilitates between 2 or more people to get an agreement. Unfortunately, it's very focused on getting an agreement. It's different from conciliation because actually the mediator is not allowed to come with their advice. So they can only facilitate what the people involved wants to include in the agreement. So we have more and more restorative sessions, and these restorative sessions also involve, for an example, the affected people mostly, and they can also include community, their own community. They focus a lot more on creating awareness on the damage and heal traumas. So solution focus is quite different because they're not focusing on who's right. They're focusing on relations as a premise, and they're also involving a lot of unlimited amount of people, creating space for being heard. It's more flexible, and it's focusing a lot more on how you actually notice the differences and the changes. So, oh, sorry, I just have to put on the next one here. Yeah, I'm sure most of us, we have a lot of experiences that can illustrate how the solution-focused approach looks like in situations related to justice. In another setting and time frame, it would definitely represent an important step to be able to explore this together and in a more interactive way. For now, I would like to share how the contribution of solution-focused approach to justice has looked like in my experience. With a few examples only from micro and to macro level. I want to make clear that I have been obliged to change some details to maintain the confidentiality of the cases. So how does this look like in action? Can we see? 2 seconds. For some years ago in Mexico, a new energy reform was approved that opens up for more foreign investments and give priority to energy projects over any other activities. This means that for small local population who do not maybe agree with the project or the lateral changes, such as motorways or changes in the landscapes, the government has a right to dismiss their needs and claims and to continue the project anyway, because it is a national priority. So while the local population are not taking part of the main decision, they have, though, the right to access to companies' earnings from the projects. So, however, the only one who can actually access to this negotiation about the earnings are the people with land deeds and house deeds in order. So if they have that and everything is in order, they can have a negotiation from one-to-one or the landowners with the companies. To assure justice and make it accessible and flexible, part of the right of the people fulfilling these criteria, they can go with a professional mediator facilitating the agreement of how much money they will get and what they need, what they need to be able to repair eventual damages. I was part of some of these processes, and while the public agents involved worked on options for quality mediations between landowners and companies, the solution-focused approach on identifying things that matter through questions on relations made me look way beyond the negotiation of a so-called agreement. I start asking, what difference would a just agreement make? Who would notice that? In what moment, who might do what? And it turned out that in many of the communities where negotiations were finding place, actually the communities were starting to get fragmented by severe internal conflicts related to the projects. So land and house owners who had got to very fruitful agreements, they lost their friendships, their families were split up, and people were just moving out. So for some, the economical gain was not worth it as they lost the life that they had. So the solution-focused approach allowed us to understand that the experience of justice was strongly connected to maintaining and restoring relations in the community. It was not possible, of course, because of my work to reform the whole law and include new processes, but the public institutions directly involved, they designed parallel initiatives to contribute to the community process as a whole and not only focusing on small negotiations. Another example that I would like to share is about the gender perspective. So like in many other countries, the movement of gender equality have been taking the streets in Mexico. So it's been ever present in debates and are finally now starting to get a better say. So in some places, the strengthened fight has taken particular forms, as at some public university where groups of young women, they have invaded whole faculties, barricaded them for months and leaving thousands and thousands of students without classes because, in their words, they want to demand rules and conditions changed, so to end patriarchy and systematic violence against women. This has often been combined with long public how do you call it, shaming walls with pictures of students and professors who assumingly are not respecting women. And this has also allowed, it has been followed, these shaming walls, by social exclusion of the accused, as well as dismissals, and in some cases even suicide by young men who believe that they will not ever get a normal life after being exposed like that. So the most common approach of the faculties was to first identify claims and demands, try to accomplish them, and make people understand what to change. This approach was mostly led to mechanism of anonymous claims, safety measures to prevent violence, rules for correct behaviors, modules for investigation of all the non-correct behavior, and also new ways of sanctioning people. However, there was one faculty at the biggest public university in Latin America that decided to do something different. Without knowing at that time the solution-focused approach, they actually was starting to construct something similar. And together, we explored steps that later became examples for many. Without taking any value from all the other initiatives that, without any doubt, also have constructive outcomes, the solution-focused approach made us proceed very differently from the demands, the claims, and the rules and the sanctions. And we started, we're starting with, for example, asking the whole community and not only the activist groups. And we asked things like, for example, if this situation leads to constructive change in our way of interacting together, how would we notice, where and when? How would we know that this is actually a constructive change? Who else how would people from other faculties be able to see that something is different? What do I currently do that contribute to all this? What might others say that I do to contribute, or that I maybe not do to contribute? And many other questions like this. It led us to, for example, one event with 350 people from the faculty co-constructing in silence, complete silence. They were co-constructing what they were most passionate about without words. It took us also to dialogue circles where accused men and accusing women met to share experiences without being allowed to comment on the other's stories. Small change groups started popping up with both students and professors among the participants, and they began to make programs of actions inviting the community to practicing on how to identify when interaction between genders become more or less constructive. Many other things we started to do before this pandemic started, and we had to stop the project because of the pandemic. When the more radical groups, having barricaded other faculties, needed a place for meetings between them, all places around them shut the doors. The violence sometimes related to these events can be quite risky business. But we suddenly heard that they were actually planning to invade a space in this faculty where we're doing the solution-focused approach. And maybe they were going to do it with whatever means. That's what we heard. So we sent a messenger, and the messenger asked how a good place for a dialogue looked like. And we also put a few words on how it looked like for us. And then we started a dialogue that resulted in one of the most specific meetings of that kind that we have had for years. So when we saw that they had even piled the chairs before leaving, we felt sure that the approach was creating relations instead of talking about them. And in a small and very different example, this is what we could call a micro-level example. We have a workplace where a young woman and a young man had an affair. They were both very popular, good-looking and successful, which is also why the dates started a lot of gossip. This took new and overwhelming dimensions when the affair transformed into a tormented relationship, with shouting at the parking lots, the two of them ignoring each other for weeks in the cafeteria, and one day they were even starting some kind of pushing each other physically. So the relationship, it ended with lots of mutual accusations, and they were offered a mediation. When I was asked to attend the situation between this former couple, there had already been months of discussion on what sanctions might be the just one. And it was, of course, seen from the perspective of both of them. And the woman made the claim that the whole institution should be sued for gender discrimination and for stimulation of a macho culture. More than focusing on what they wanted, I defocused from that, and I tried to explore how it would look like if they somehow got closer to a point where the situation would not affect them so intensely. So interesting. None of them talked about the other person, and none of them talked about justice. They talked about groups around them, forming their work community. We could call it a work community. And it seemed like everybody was somehow participating in this situation. Groups were divided depending on whose side they were on. And there was an enormous pressure for the two young people to get a resolution that the supporters might approve of as a just agreement. So the process did not end with an agreement, actually, as it was supposed to. We worked solution-focused on how both could restore constructive relation to the rest of the community, and how especially the young woman started use the sessions for working on how to inform the community about the situation, so nobody would feel an urge for taking sides. So the last time I saw her in a session, she said, our immaturity made us unconsciously involve a whole workplace. It created an unjust situation for all of us, where nobody is right and all of us are somehow responsible. And this with the community, this is quite different. This is also a micro level case, the next one, the last one, but it's very different because this is about a kidnapping. So one day, a small bus of researchers at a village arrived at a village many, many hours away from the city where they lived. They had organized a trip for months, and finally they could study a very unique area of plants, and they could collect samples. That was why they were going to this village. But not yet. They could not start collecting anything yet, because at the small hotel they had mistaken the number of rooms for the researchers, and after a long time of quarreling, they were transferred to another hotel that were even far away. When they finally installed this small place, the coordinator of the researcher got a strange phone call by someone saying that they were all now prisoners of a group of organized crime that had surrounded the hotel. The only way for them to get out alive was to pay a certain amount of money each. So they were forced to call their families and start collecting the money. And after many hours of negotiations and logistics to have transferred money and deep anxiety attacks among researchers, they were found and released by the police. It turned out that there was no group of organized crime, and they had not really been surrounded or kidnapped. They were victims of what it's now called a virtual kidnapping, that turns out being a stunt of one or two individuals who's making extortions for money over the phone. So the responsible for this kind of crimes in Mexico are usually not captured. When going back to the city, most people in the work community did not take the experience seriously at all, because after all, it was not a real kidnapping. So, however, they were offered therapy, and most of them accepted to go to therapy. However, part of them kept looking for justice. They said, we know that justice will never happen, but we just need to find out how to feel that this is more just. And it somehow led them to an institution that asked for my intervention. At the end, when I started with them, we can say at the end of the solution-focused process, they mentioned mainly 3 things that had worked especially well for them. They mentioned that the imagined conversations with the virtual kidnappers was very useful to see clearly all small changes in their lives that they were struggling with. They also said as a second point that they were amazed by the way they seemed to restore each other by listening to how the others had lived the same moment very differently, and what had they appreciated or not appreciated about their way of acting. And third, they found out that taking up very small habits that they had appreciated before the incident was restoring the relations to their close ones. Before, one said, the deep anger I felt all the time for being a victim of so much injustice destroyed my relation to every close one close to me, and it made me just angrier. Perhaps now, injustice will not get me. And I think that those who are here today, they will easily be able to imagine the question that I ask. I will not have to repeat that. So this is just to finalize this. This is just very few examples of how it looks like when we use a solution-focused approach to justice. Though perhaps not all of us work with these situations, however, we can all add similar stories to this. These experiences I have shared today, and millions of others, tell us that independently of how we define justice or create justice, the feeling of having achieved it is closely connected to an experience of being restored. And that this restoration is much more about recreating these constructed relations than about being right or about having won. So perhaps not only the Mbuti's pygmies have this bubble around them, all of us might have one. So our ways to manage justice in society urgently need a transition into being restorative in many different forms. The last 10, 15 years show that many reforms, public programs and initiatives are heading in that direction. We can see that in the radically growing use of methods like what we talked about before, like mediation, conciliation, collaborative negotiation, community circles. Some of them I have mentioned. In this transition of new ways of thinking and creating justice, solution focus has a great potential and not yet explored. It's a very important role to play. When our permanent becoming with our surroundings are distressed by experiences turned into needs for justice, the solution focused approach makes it easier to find restoration and to connect relations. So solution-focused practice makes it easier for bubbles to be bubbles. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing the screen. So hello there. I don't know if you have any questions or comments or something you would like to share.
Just one question for me. Great presentation. Thank you. In terms of the restorative questions, because I know that there are 5 questions that would normally be asked of the what do you call them again? I don't want to say the victim. It's not the victim because the language is changed. So those restorative questions, to what extent are they modified or used in this approach?
To what extent are they modified from?
Or used in this with solution focus?
They're not modified in compared to what?
No, I was just wondering, those restorative questions, you know the questions I'm talking, right? what happened? What did
Oh,
you
yeah, okay, yeah, yeah, I didn't hear that part. That
Right.
the repetitive questions that usually is used, yes, they are actually modified a little bit, because many times when we start with these situations, the focus is not necessarily on what has happened, and the focus is not necessarily of who did what or who are responsible. So usually the restorative sessions, that has a main objective in one session or one or two sessions to start creating this awareness of the damage and the awareness of the traumas that people have felt. And the responsible persons are participating in the sessions. So here it's quite different, because first of all, every situation is so different that many times they don't get to know each other. Other times, as we talked about at the macro level, they will not be able to talk with each other, everybody in the macro level. So it could be very small parts of dialogue with a lot of different people that create a change in a group. And usually I would never start asking what happened and what do you feel about it. And I would not use a protocol that is also very common in restorative justice session, that you use a protocol with 5-8 questions and you take it rigidly. So I would start asking, as we usually do in solution focus, what is it, depending on the situation, what is it that they would like to see different?
Okay.
But usually most of these examples that I shared today are not like sessions that have a clear start and a clear ending. It's relationships, it's meetings, it's a lot of different dialogues. It could be community dialogues combined with individual sessions. So it's not a fixed method.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. And I'm just kind of looking for a start point if I'm going to assume take this on as an approach. You know, I'm integrating the restorative justice with the solution focus. I'm looking at how do I then start the conversation, and how do I know when it ends? I don't know. I'm just because.
What kind of sessions do you usually have? Because if you have a session where you actually where it's set up and everybody is prepared for a restorative session, then it has a very specific preparation of it. Or if it's just a solution-focused approach that is used in a restorative way in different kind of situation, which is not necessarily any damage. It's not necessarily crime. It's not necessarily a situation where we say, okay, we have a damage that we have to repair. So it's very important to know what kind of settings that you're working in.
Okay, I appreciate that, because I'm thinking I haven't started yet, but it's a plan I have to work with some children in a particular kind of environment. And I am solution focused in my approach, but I'm also trained in restorative justice. And so I am just trying to find a way, you know, of how to use, whether it will be the solution focus that inform the use of the restorative practices, or the other way around. So I get what
I value very much the restorative justice, the classical restorative justice sessions where they have a protocol with the same questions. However, I would not do that normally. I would prepare with every person or with very small groups before they get together to find out what process could we make together that makes sense for every one of them. And many times it doesn't make sense to talk about responsibilities, and it doesn't make sense to start talking about damages. Many times it makes more sense, like in the gender perspective case, it makes more sense to start creating things together and to start having a common platform to work on. but it depends. If something very severe has happened, of course, it's we need to talk about the damage.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Is there anybody else who would like to share this understanding of justice and the relation between justice and solution focus approach?
I'd just like to ask a question about courage, because it seems to me that to do the type of work that you do takes extraordinary courage. And I just wondered what you feel like you personally bring that enables you to do this and how you do it.
That was a good question. I'm not really sure that I can answer it, but I suppose that after so many years with working with the solution focus approach, I have a very, very strong belief that it works and that it will find its way. So even when we have had very violent conflicts and we have been met with situations that seemed very stuck, it seems as one of the first things about assuming that it will work and assuming that it's possible and assuming that we have something to construct with is a first very important step. I even think that somehow that makes other people see things that they usually don't see. And perhaps even that is part of a recognition that changes things. This recognition that we are able to create a change. Does that make sense, Carrie?
It does. I have other questions, but I don't want to hog the time. If there's anyone else who has a question, can they go first? Okay, I'm in luck. In these situations, and I can't remember, someone else will remember which therapist it is who talks about having one foot in recognising what's happened and one in the future. In difficult, truly difficult situations where there has been a lot of damage, can you tell us a little bit about the process you use for acknowledgement and how you move people on?
And how?
And how you then, and at what point, how do you decide then to move people on, but how do you first deal with the acknowledging the damage that has happened as part of the wider? So when you bring people together, you don't, all of that. How do you use that whole process when acknowledgement is very important of what's happened to people?
I think it's very different if it's a micro level or macro level. In a micro level, we start talking about many times the experience that everyone has had, and that experience, how it has affected them, what kind of changes it has caused for them, and how the impact of these changes, how is that impact on the rest of their relations, and not only how it has changed them, but how it has changed so many lives around them. Like, for example, in this kidnapping, the virtual kidnapping case, every one of them started talking about at least 10 or 15 people that were directly very affected by the situation. And something happens when people are able to share that experience without commenting. And that's maybe a very important part of that phase, that it's not commenting on each other's stories. And I had, for example, one of the very small examples I mentioned with a gender perspective. There, in one dialogue, we had 5 women that had very, very difficult experiences with men. And they were not exactly the men that were sitting in the same room, but it was men from the same institution. And the men who were accused by other women was also present. So when they started to hear each other's story without being able to comment on it, they could construct upon it, they could add, they could tell their point of view, but without any kind of comments or opinions. Something, I know it sounds strange, but it's something magical happens. So after the first 2-3 rounds we had, the men who started the dialogue saying, I have never ever hurt anybody. I am completely innocent. I'm accused of something I've not ever done. After listening 2-3 hours without any break, because they didn't want any break at that time, something happened. And they said, okay, now I can understand that it's possible that I have hurt people without wanting it, without the intention. And the women started saying, okay, I have anonymously denounced them, demanded, and I have made anonymous denouncement. I would have loved to be able to look at them and tell us all this before denouncing. So this is a part of it that I think it's extremely important part, to be able to be silent together and to be able to share that kind of stories. So that's what I do when it's not directly the responsible. So if we don't have a rapist with us and they're not together, offender and victim, whatever, if it's not directly like that, I would do it in that way as the first part, before talking about what could be different. Or yeah. So that's one part of it that makes them feel very listened to. What we have done in other setting, which is macro setting, is that usually we make communications with very, very careful language. And the first thing we've done was to walk around and speak with people very informally to hear what words did they use, what language what narratives did they have around the situations or the violent incidents, and what it meant to them and what they wanted. And then we tried to make communication, collective communications that were containing and recognizing the incident. So the first part of the communication platform, written communication, is very difficult in that way. Solution-focused written communication in a long documents, it's not easy, but it's possible, and I think it's a very good first step. Yeah. Was that helpful, or would you like another example on it?
I'm sure lots of people would like examples. Yes, that was helpful. In terms of how you're going about it is fantastic, like talking about how your communication. The other question that was in my mind was, you said before about, you said a comment about context, when I think it was Winsome asked you a question, and she said it was about children, and you talked about the importance of, in passing, you said, oh, well, it depends on the environment and the context. Could you comment on that as well?
Comment on that in what way? If it depends on the context, what I do? Yes, completely. Because as I say, if it's something where you have people who have been in a violent incident in the same time, where they've been both involved, it needs one kind of approach, and I would never put them together to start with, never ever. I would not create any dialogue. I would find even about, if the dialogue, I've had cases where the dialogue had to start with small drawings together, or with one person in one place writing small notes. And even though I thought it was not the most constructive thing that could happen, it actually worked for them. So they went from small notes to a small message on the mobile phone, and then they said, okay, let's just meet. So I mean, it's so different from situation to situation, and that is maybe where solution focus has a huge richness, because we're quite flexible. We don't need to follow a protocol. We don't need to have step after step. So we don't need this protocol necessarily to say, okay, how do we start and how do we end? Depending on the case, I can take 1 or 2 weeks to start to think of the framing of a session, or the framing of a meeting. So what is the first sentence? What is the first 3 sentences of a meeting we're going to have? And it can take me a week or 2. Because that first sentence, that first question will completely determine what happens next. I don't know if that gives a little bit more detail. So I think maybe what is important here is to trust the richness and the diversity of solution focus that much, that we use our own questions, these questions, we use that for ourselves all the time. I use that on myself all the time. So I would not say, what protocol do I need? I would say, okay, what do I need to do to know what the first step is? Who do I need to speak to make sure that this first step is useful? Where do I need to go to find the information I need to be able to take the decision? So, I mean, there's a lot of solution-focused questions before actually starting to have contact with people, perhaps, yeah. Was that helpful?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Is there anybody else that would like to share a comment or ask?
We've had restorative justice practices here in New Zealand for some years, but the way it's administered, a culture has sprung up around it where the perpetrators think that if they offer an apology, that will be it. So they know that that's what's expected of them. And so they can still minimize the harm they've done so long as they apologize. And the so-called victims are waking up to that.
That's yeah, okay. Sorry.
So I was very interested in what as you say, the opening question and the process, because that's just the beginning of the process, but here that's becoming the end of the process.
Yeah, I think we have to distinguish very much how the restorative justice is in informal settings, the legal systems, how they use the restorative justice with the protocols, and how I am using a restorative perspective in my way of doing solution-focused practice. So I would not say that I'm doing restorative justice. I would say I'm using a restorative perspective in my solution-focused practice. And I think you're completely right that something has happened in the legal systems that, for an example, in many countries and many states, the restorative justice, when you say that you're sorry and you show that you are regretting, you can even negotiate your sentence. You can even negotiate the time you're going to do in prison or whatever. And that has been very, very difficult. Yeah, I even find that it could work out. In Mexico, for an example, we have it after the sentence. So you will not be able to negotiate. You will not you will not go out earlier. You will not shorten the process necessarily, but you can work with not only the person who has been affected by the situation, but also with your own community. And I think that that is another way of seeing restorative justice. And I think it's a little bit difficult, as you also say, that restorative justice has now been about apologizing and about getting to a certain result. I think that restorative justice should not have a certain result, because every case is different, and whatever situation we work with that is complicated, with or without crimes, and with or without violence, will be completely different. And many times it's even best that they don't come to an agreement at all, because they work it out in a different way and they restore the relations to community in a different way. And yeah, I don't know if that's, yeah. So I think it's very important not to focus on a special outcome. I think it's sad, yeah.
The principal court, youth court judge in New Zealand has said about restorative justice, it's a good idea, but the fruit has withered on the vine. You know.
Yeah, I think it is a good idea, because I think in many cases you get something incredible out of it, and if it's good quality process, it changes life. It changes lives. So I think it is a good idea, but I think it could be even more effectful if we didn't have a process focused on a certain outcome. Because then we could actually find out what relations people would like to restore, and what is it. That's also the examples I showed. It is actually the opposite of what a legal justice system would say, because many times people say, okay, I feel justice if I can restore my relation to the rest of the community, and actually I don't care any longer about the person who done me wrong. Or many times when we work with this in a restorative perspective, people say, actually, I think I'm the responsible one. And I have more than once. I have cases where people have been violent or have been victims of violence, and after a certain time of work, they say, you know what, I'm not a victim of violence. I was a violent one, and I've been doing whatever to make that person be aggressive that one time. So I mean, it's very difficult to put it into very fixed protocols. Silence is good. 5 minutes of silence. And how do you relate justice and solution focus approach? Some of you? Do you find that there's actually a relation, or is it a completely different area, or is it something very difficult, different from what we usually do? Or how do you find it?
Hello.
I began using it about 30 years ago with victims of family sexual assault, and by taking a restorative justice solution focus to those situations, and I fell in love with both solution focus and restorative justice then.
Yeah, so you find that it has been quite easy to relate these two.
Yeah, it is, but that's pretty informal. when you get to working in the justice system, you know, there's all sorts of other things come into play, especially the culture.
The culture of?
The culture of the justice system.
Yeah, you're right. It's a very special culture. I worked for 8 years as an advisor in legal systems, so in the justice system, and it's very different from other contexts.
Yeah.
But what I think it's one of my points, at least, that I would like to make is that all justice should be restorative. So I think that actually we don't have any justice in any kind of situation if it doesn't have this restorative perspective. So that's why I actually called this, the title of this session was Restorative Justice with big letters, because I think it's impossible to separate it. And I think maybe it's taking a little bit longer time because we have used to think about restorative justice as one method that is kind of attached of the legal systems, and not a restorative approach that we can use in many different settings. So I think maybe it will take some more years to get the restorative justice out of this attached thing in the legal system, and maybe make it the main, the sense of a justice system. Yeah.
Hi. Sorry, I don't have video right now, but I'm new to, like, I just to let you know, I'm not really I don't have very much knowledge in terms of restorative justice, and new to solution focus. So hopefully my question will not be too silly, but I'm wondering of from what I've heard, which is extremely interesting, and I didn't get you from the beginning, which I'm hoping I'll be able to see this later, but the relationship of justice, whether restorative or not, to solution focus in a context of unequal power relations, when justice itself is not a site that, and maybe even restorative, is not even a site that we can come to trust in those situations, particularly for those who have been historically sort of marginalized. So I guess the question is have you, of course you have, but to speak more about that relationship of with power and different kind of power relations.
Yeah, that was a very good one. Thank you for that one, Lorena. I think it's an extremely important question when we talk about a restorative perspective, to include the power as an aspect, especially as I talked in the beginning of the session of how trust, how this crisis of trust in the legal systems is this enormous crisis of trust. People are very dissatisfied with it, and we have more and more studies showing the bias of social bias, status bias, gender bias, race bias in the justice system. And I think that when we use solution focus in a restorative setting, it's impossible to do it without including the power perspective and include a lot of questions on it all the time to make sure who is who. Maybe it's important again to separate a little bit the settings, because we were talking about macro settings, which are completely different, because you have maybe a whole region or a whole city or a group of indigenous people, and it's a very different way that we can work with the power perspective and include it very visibly and very directly. What I would do there is to try to map a moving map, a changing map every day, almost every week, every day, to find out who is identifying the power of who feels that they're repressed by whom, and where do people feel in the hierarchical relations. And I try to understand that by asking them questions all the time, not directly on power, but I would ask, for an example, if I come to a small village and we have difficulties, I would ask, and if that person would ask for help, to whom would he go? Okay, if that person would need to make a decision, this and that, who would they ask? Oh, they would ask that one. He's the one who decides everything. Okay, and if he was not to decide, who would be there? So I think the solution-focused approach has this very strong focus on relations, and I think it makes it more adaptable to work in justice in situations with inequality, and very strong power relations. Mm-hmm. In smaller settings, I am mostly aware of it also when we have to make agreements. When we have to make agreements, written agreements, it's extremely important to have to check out again and again, especially also for gender perspective and power relationship, the status, if they're actually accepting the agreement because they feel that they don't have anything else to do, or are they constructing the agreement together? So I would keep asking different questions around that. So I would say, okay, so if this agreement for you, and I would do that separately so they don't hear each other. I would say this agreement for you on a scale on 1 to 10, where 10 is an agreement that is, and then I would try to put in all these things, and 1 is the opposite. Where do you feel it? Where do you find this? In 5. Okay. And then I would start working on what is it that could be different to make this agreement reflect more quality. Mm. Was that useful, or would you like some other examples, or do you have another question?
No, I in what you were saying, I was just thinking, so equality is kind of like the preferred future that you're looking for in that relationship, in a sense, whether it's with a person or with a group, or am I totally, did I go in a totally different direction?
Not necessarily. It's not in everything that you have to put it in. For example, if we are, if it's not really a problem, maybe you don't have to put it in as a topic, but you can also perceive it and reflect on it without talking about power relations all the time. And it's not a preferred future necessarily, because if people are, for an example, working on having a better relationship with their family after a violent incident that has nothing to do with the family, maybe equality is not a preferred future. Mm-hmm. Or for I don't know, because we had a kidnapping case here that we were talking about for a little while ago. Mm-hmm. And for an example, they were not having any need for talking about equality. They wanted to restore the relations and to feel that they were able to have these relations without the anger of injustice and the violence that they have lived with other people. So then equality is not a preferred future. The preferred future for them would be to feel they have a place again, right? Mm-hmm. And for every one of them, it was completely different. Mm-hmm. Okay. But if, for an example, let me give you another case. If, for an example, one of the cases I mentioned today was with a couple, and this couple had very aggressive actions toward each other, and especially the man was very violent in his language, and he had also pushed his girlfriend and things like that. Not ever hit her, but pushed her. In a situation like that, I would be extremely careful to find out what is the power relationship between them. And I would also be extremely careful not to assume that there is a relationship where the woman who's been receiving or who's been living this violent situation is, how can we say that she's not, that she's not part of the situation. Mm-hmm. And I think in this situation with the relationship, as I also talked about, she ended up saying, I understand I have a lot of responsibility now, and now I will be able to restore the situation because now I know I can act and I can do something. I'm not just a passive victim. So that the recognition of her own responsibility in the situation, and it's not to justify any kind of violent acting, but it's just to say that people live it differently, and it's very important to be careful to explore that a lot.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's really helpful because it just brought to mind, like, not to sort of impose these categories that you already have built in your head about I might think, oh, she being a woman in a patriarchal society, blah blah blah, definitely will, be the victim, but without any kind of almost like no agency, right? So so that's really interesting to think about it, and it's in the relationship that you ascertain through the questions, right? That gets brought out.
Yeah, I think again, with this risk of repeating myself, but I think that the focus that we have on exploring these relations, it's helping us a lot to understand what is going on. Because in many conflict situations, we're talking about people in general. When we handle conflicts, we're talking about who have done what they want, how we can achieve that or sanction that. And or we maybe talk about how the system is finding justice in this, or how other people look at this as a just process. So I think that is quite dangerous, actually, because it means that people, even though they're participating, are not having an agency. So they can participate without having an agency because it's all put in a very certain frame where you cannot answer anything else. So if we put this in a certain frame and answer people, do you feel violated? Or if we see who done what, or he actually hit me. Okay, so then we're only focusing, and we're not focusing on what changes did this cause? What changes in relations did this cause? What happened before? What happened after? How did the communication change between them? What was it useful for and what was it not useful? So there's so many other questions beyond what have people done in a certain moment.
Okay.
So that's why I find it so important to explore the relations and to all the time explore noticeable changes. So the notable changes for me has been a huge clue to find progress in complicated situations. To ask again and again and again, how would that look like? And if other people looked at it, how would it look like, and whatever. And in that exploration, I will be able to see if there's some very complicated power relations that doesn't permit a person to go forward with the situation. Sorry, Nick?
Have you got much publications?
I don't have that many publications. I would love to have, but I don't have that many publications.
Wow, this calls out for being published.
Yes. Yes, there's in that new journal. You should publish that new journal. Just this talk.
We'll be looking for them. Or the first one anyway. First small change. We'll look for the first one soon.
Very small, notable change.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for saying that. That was nice. And I think that actually my best hopes would be that in the next World Conference that we would talk about justice and solution focus, and that we would understand the huge potential that solution focus has within the context of justice. And I'm not talking about the legal systems. I'm talking about all the experiences of justice that we live. Because I think that solution focus has something to offer that is so unique, and that we cannot find, even though many other methods are wonderful and they have very effective outcomes, as mediation, conciliation, restorative circles. There are so many useful things, but I think solution focus can something very special because of the flexibility, because of the focus on relations, and because of these explorations of notable change. So,
That sounds like a good note to end on.
So I was thinking that if you don't have anything else, is there anybody who would like to use the last minute for?
I'd just like to thank you.
Yes, me too. So much.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you.